We now have reports from different reporters, different journalists, specifically about the White House briefing room. This is where they have press conferences, they do briefs. They typically have reporters from either big businesses, big corporations, or even smaller businesses, smaller corporations, independent journalists. What we're seeing, the reports, are that specific journalists, specific reporters are being discriminated against. They're having their, you get a permit, like a briefing room permit to be in that room, to be part of the press. They're having their access revoked, or if they are allowed in that room, they're not being picked for answers. Now, especially with this administration, there's a lot of pre-selection that's done. The people are pre-selected, the corporations are pre-selected, the questions are pre-selected. When this current president or people in the administration, they decide to pick people in the audience, it's already pre-selected who they're going to pick. They already know who they're going to pick on. They already know what the question is going to be. They already know what they're going to answer. This is all done beforehand. Now, typically, you want something that's less scripted than that. You can have a typical structure, but to make it 100% scripted is doing a disservice to the American people. We are there, the press is there in that room to ask questions, difficult questions, skeptical questions, curious questions about the current administration and what they are not or what they are doing that is either hurting or helping the current system of the United States of America. What is the State of the Union? And this is like an everyday, not everyday thing, but typically, what is the State of the Union today, tomorrow, this week? Typically, there's a once-a-year speech, the State of the Union, but doing press like this is essentially finding updates based on current events, whether it's political policy, economics, what's going on with the governors and the states, certain cultural issues. These are important issues that trickle down from the top at the federal government to the states and then to local government. So indirectly, but also directly in many instances, like a simple executive order could directly affect you. How does this affect you? And why is it important? And then it's necessary to get to the bottom of it. But when we have a current administration who's discriminating against people who are not aligned with their narrative, instead the current administration is picking journalists, picking reporters who are part of certain corporations who align themselves with the establishment. So they're no longer independent free press, right? Part of the First Amendment is you have the right to petition your government, you have the right to a free press. These two parts of the five of the First Amendment are there to hold the government accountable. The government has a lot of unchecked power. So the power that checks it, one part of the power that checks it is the press, is the right to petition your government. What happens is these big corporations, they turn into monoliths. They work with the federal government because they have similar ideology, and maybe we'll tackle that later on. And they often create a synergistic effect. So for example, a lot of reporters, they'll be selected and they'll go on Air Force One with the president and the staff and the cabinet. And they'll be treated to lavish experiences. They get to travel, X, Y, and Z. Now I'm just giving a basic example of these individuals who are reporters, how, these are like the boots on the ground. The executives at the media companies, they're not actually there on Air Force One. These are the reporters. So they're cozying up to the president and the staff. Naturally, part of human psychology is to reciprocate. So if someone is treating you well in that instance, you're less likely to ask difficult questions of the administration. You're more likely to turn a blind eye if they're doing something that's improper. The people who don't get invited to Air Force One, or the people who are more independent journalists, independent reporters, or they're from smaller media companies, they try to get into that briefing room. They don't have access because they don't get that little permit, the little license. Or they do get access, but they're never called on. They're never picked. Or they're never brought onto Air Force One. They're never in the situation where they're being rewarded or X, Y, and Z. So we need to go back to independent press, independent petitioning of the government, because what we're seeing is less accountability day in and day out. Now, I'll also point out there are, because this is part of the mainstream narrative when you have the briefing room in tandem with cable news or legacy news. Cable is going down significantly. It's dropping like a rock. Sooner or later, it'll turn into radio and newspaper. And sure, there are still listeners on radio, there's still readers of newspaper, but the amount of people who are watching cable, that's part of the older generation. The new generation is doing a lot of things like YouTube Premium, ESPN Online. They're doing a lot of they're purchasing these premium viewing content on their phone, on their tablet. They're not sitting in front of a TV, or if they are, they're still streaming it from a different type of platform like Apple TV. But what we're seeing is legacy media and the federal government, they're working together, and they're even propped up on these different media platforms. You go on the homepage of some of these major conglomerates, you'll have MSNBC, NBC, ABC propped up right at the homepage. So even though they have to make that transition, and they're losing an audience size from their typical TV cable platform, they're still being perpetrated on the online platforms because they have to make that transition. That's a whole different discussion. So these two are working together. Independent creators are coming out and they're saying, hey, look, what's on the TV, what's on cable news, what's on mainstream media news, they're not directly reporting what they should be reporting. Instead, they're reporting a very narrow view of what the federal government wants to report and what these big media conglomerates want to report in tandem with the current regime. Why is that? Why are they not presenting different perspectives? Well, we all acknowledge that if we look at China, if we look at Russia, if we look at any of these other developing nations, they often have propagandist news channels. So we know that China may have 3, 4, 5 different news channels, Russia the same, and we can acknowledge from an American point of view, most people can acknowledge this, there is propaganda that is being propagated on those media networks. Whether it's you have 3 channels, 4 channels, 5 channels, they most likely are spreading propaganda. Now the perspective may be slightly tilted a little bit, 5 degrees here, 10 degrees here, but it's never going to be too wide. It's never going to be that obtuse. It's going to be very acute and very narrow. We understand, again, even from an American point of view, when we look at Russia, when we look at China, they have a certain incentive, they have a certain ideology, and they want to perpetrate that to their population. They want their population to fit in this small box of information of what is acceptable. When they widen that box, well, they acknowledge if they were to widen that box, that would give too much power to the people because they would have access to new information, more information. When they have access to more information, they can utilize that through action. And these current governments, Russia, China, I'm using them as an example, but there are tens, hundreds of other countries that do the same. If they give too much information, too much actionable information to the population, that is a threat to their government body. These people want to stay in power. They recognize at some level they have to psychologically or physically, in many cases, control their population. The United States of America is no different. We like to believe, because overtly, when we look around, it looks like a free country. Behind the scenes are the workings and the turning of gears that make it a more authoritarian regime every single year. Since the inception at 1776, and of course we had the American Revolution, then 1781, okay, we're a nation. 1787, we have the Constitution. After that, we introduced the Bill of Rights. They become the amendments. So this is a process. But since the inception of the United States of America, there are people who see that, okay, there's power in this niche, and there's a lot of potential there. Let me go into this niche. No different than if you see a company, whether it's a startup or whether it's a big conglomerate, you're looking for opportunity. And if you can gain power, wealth, influence, resources, you're going to pursue those places of opportunity. So people do that with America. Now, we have a meritocracy in America very different than most other nations, especially developing nations. A meritocracy is basically based off your competency, based off your skills, your talents, which you can develop. You can go from 0 to 100. Let me put it in a different way. You can go from not making any money to having a relatively high net worth compared to the rest of the population in a meritocratic system, which means America is the best place to raise your socioeconomic positioning, to raise your status, and then you'll want to create a barrier to entry to blockade anyone from competing with you, which is now anti-meritocracy. So people are finding themselves in a position of opportunity in America. Then they get that opportunity, they leverage it, they're in a good position. Now they want to remove that opportunity from everyone else. Part of removing that opportunity from everyone else is making sure people have limited information. So when you limit information and you look at all these independent creators that are coming out on these different online platforms, we will see the suppression, the censorship, and a lot of times oppression through criticism of these independent creators because they don't fit within the mainstream narrative platform. What they're speaking about, and I would consider myself an independent creator as well, but I'm more tackling everything from an analytical point of view. Am I presenting different perspectives that are outside the narrowing of the legacy media? Yes, 100%. But it's more so to make you think, which is also the antithesis of what they want, right? They don't want people to critically think because when you critically think, again, you can take action on a wider, a more broad spectrum of ideas and concepts. So you'll have the suppression, the censorship of words, language, information, concepts, ideas, and independent creators who bring up these ideas and concepts. And so it's like suffocating these independent creators who are trying to bring out information that they believe the masses should have access to. And then you only have access to a few channels. I listed a few before. And these channels may tilt 5, 10, 15 degrees, but they're often presenting the same similar view. And the federal government endorses them, right? They work with each other. We all typically know this, especially people who are watching this channel. When we look at politics, when we look at economics, when we look at these big institutions, media institutions as well, they're often revolving doors. What that means is you'll have the same people who go in a financial institution, then they'll go into the media institution. Let me present a more realistic example. You have someone who works for an intelligence agency, okay? If people don't already know what that means, CIA, NSA. They work for an intelligence agency. They are part of the federal government because they're under they're under the executive branch. Then they will go into media, and they will be part of, let's say, Operation Mockingbird. People don't know what that is. It's basically the dissemination of mis and disinformation, which started allegedly during the Cold War era, to spread so much misinformation to the general public in America that it would also go to the USSR. At the time, America and the USSR were competing. It would go to the USSR. And then also, they would have misinformation because the American people are going to talk, right? Even if it's on a global level. It just takes time to scale. The American public would be misinformed. Therefore, the USSR would be misinformed. That would provide leverage to the US military and to US intelligence to leverage that current information system against the USSR and beat them out. In this case, it was economically. Although there were other instances, there was physical threat due to nuclear weapons, you had the space race, all that. But all that led to the economic fallout of the USSR. So when you take, let me get back on this. When you take out people's tongues, you take out their ability to hold government accountable. By the way, not allowing, there is some discrimination in the White House in terms of you have to discriminate, you have to be selective of who you're going to invite into the briefing room. There's only so many people can hold. But technically speaking, it is 100% constitutional for people to go into the briefing room. Now, culturally, policy-wise, like policy as in like here are the rules for this current situation, we want to be civilized. So we want to adhere to a certain standard. Okay, you have access. But to make it constitutional, the White House would have to pick a diverse group of people, not only to be accepted in the briefing room. Okay, so this includes the wide range of the spectrum. So people who you 100% disagree with, all the way on the left, to people all the way on the right who you 100% disagree with, to people all the way on the left who you agree with, and people in the middle as well. So you have to have the whole wide array of people come into that briefing room to make it constitutional, because they all have the right, we all have the right to petition the government, we all have the right to a free press. You can't have a free press if you're only picking people who are Democrat, or you're only picking people who are Republican, or you're only picking people who are part of the establishment. You have to pick even the outsiders, the outcasts, the people who even most people would disagree with their opinion. But to make it constitutional, you have to make that situation diverse. Then you have to actually select them to ask questions. And you can't be pre-selecting questions, because then you're creating a script. You're only selecting certain people. You're only selecting certain questions. You're only answering it. Fine, the answer, you can answer it however you want. But you have to allow people to ask questions. I'll use a radical extreme example. These people, these reporters, can also use profanity. That's constitutional. That's 100% constitutional. But I would guarantee if they were to use profanity, or if they were to yell, they would most likely be kicked out of that briefing room. And that would also be unconstitutional, because that's freedom of speech. You have the right to do that, while you also have the right to hold government accountable by petition or by free press. The fact that we don't have that, the fact that the White House is saying, no, we only agree with these people, these corporations, these media organizations who we work with on a day-to-day basis. And these other media organizations, these other independent, smaller creators, no, we're not going to listen to you. We're not going to take your questions. You're not going to be in this. That is treason. There's no other way to put it, right? If you're breaking anything in the Bill of Rights, you're committing treason. You're removing a type of absolute right that the public has access to, that private citizens have access to. And those rights are also given to businesses, because businesses are made out of private citizens. So private citizens and private companies are not able to hold government accountable. This is a huge issue when it comes to actually having access to ideas and concepts. People already understand what it's like in developing countries. We can go to different countries in Africa, we can go to different countries in Asia, we can go to Singapore, okay? There's a lot of these countries are nice. You can go to these countries and they're clean, they're well kept, they have relatively high GDP, but they're also very strict. They don't have, private citizens don't have absolute rights. In Singapore, for example, if you spit out gum on the sidewalk or on the road, it's a jailable offense, to my knowledge. Here in America, it would be considered littering and a fine, and technically the fine would make up for you spitting out the gum, because it would cost a lot more for you to pay the fine than to clean up the gum. So it would be a net positive. It shouldn't be an exorbitant amount, but it would be a net positive for that local city. Whereas in Singapore, it's now such an intrusion of your individual rights for a minor action that you don't have that as the main foundational structure just from observation. So we want to uphold that. We want to uphold all of our Bill of Rights. And this video, I'm just covering the First Amendment. I'm actually covering 2 parts of the First Amendment. There's a whole list of rights that we have. And in every video, I try to cover whatever right is associated with the incident. In this, it's 2 parts of a right. It's not even the whole right. It's just 2 parts: petitioning of the government and the right to a free press. If we don't have that, we have no accountability for the government, because the ultimate we have checks and balances with the 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, judicial. I've presented this a few times before. There's an ultimate flaw with this, because the executive branch, even though there's supposed to be a checks and balances, like let's say the executive branch does something that's unconstitutional. The legislature, the U.S. legislature can come in and say, that's unconstitutional, you're breaking a law. In fact, you're doing something that is not even a law on the books. The judicial branch, so legislative, they write the law, okay? Judicial, they interpret the law. They will say, hey, executive branch, that's not how we're interpreting this. You're doing something that's unconstitutional. The executive branch, because they have all the force and the power, and I kind of regret saying this because it could give people ideas, but it's already happening anyways. The executive branch has all the power. Force is the ultimate authority. So they could tell the judicial branch and the legislative branch to screw off, and there's nothing that the judicial branch and the legislative branch are going to do. The judicial branch doesn't have any type of protection force. They don't have any of that. The legislative have Capitol Police, but it's very small. It's very minor. The executive branch has the FBI, the NSA, the CIA. They have over 100 different agencies. I can't even list them all. That is a huge government overreach of power, because now they can bully the other 2 branches any which way, and ultimately that's how you lead to an authoritarian regime. So that is a type of check and balance, although it's not ideal. The next check and balance is, okay, there are, let's say, a few hundred people in government who are controlling the rest of the agencies, and then in the agencies you have thousands of people. Let's say you have hundreds at the people at the top of the hierarchy, and then you have thousands who are at the tops of hierarchies within the agencies, okay? So not the actual agency. Like if you're a CIA agent, special agent, I'm not counting you. I'm counting your boss, your director. We the people, we have hundreds of millions of people, okay? But let's say the people who would be part of a combating organization, there would be tens of millions of people. So tens of millions of people versus thousands of people. That's a lot of power that we can use to check the government. That's what these rights are for. When we're no longer able to check the government, and no one says anything, everyone around us, the entire population is saying, oh, well, like, that's just the way it is. And everyone is too distracted and not in the right mindset, or not in the right headspace, or not educated enough to take any kind of willful action. We are letting a centralized power get bigger and bigger and bigger. We're letting them take away our rights. We're letting them right in our face, spit in our face, and say, nope, we're going to keep doing what we're going to do, and there's nothing you're going to do about it. We are letting them do this. And as a byproduct, you lose your nation over time, because these centralized authorities, they will come in and then they'll stomp on the Constitution. They don't care about a piece, how they see it is a piece of paper with some writing on it. They care about their short-term self-interested interests. They're not worried or concerned about the rest of Americans. A lot of people will see this as, well, my day-to-day isn't changing. You know, okay, inflation is going up a little bit, gas is going up a little bit, I can still afford it. There's a lot more to it than you see. And it happens slowly and gradually and gradually. People have mentioned this before, I've talked about this before. It's like the frog in the boiling pot analogy. You have lukewarm water, you put a frog in there. You slowly turn up the heat over the course of the hour. As it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, the frog, the toad, is accustomed to the temperature, and it's not really noticing the gradual increase of temperature. By the time it notices, he's fried. If you boil water, okay, it's already boiling, the water's going up and down, it's erratic, you take a frog and you throw it in there, the frog will jump out immediately. So what you'll see with these policies is things are dialed up very slowly. Anytime the policies are pushed in a quick succession, short period of time, that's when people have a wake up. So the past 3 to 4 years, when we saw the pandemic, where everything locked down, businesses, rights were infringed on, people couldn't even go to their church, and that's part of the First Amendment also. They couldn't go to their church and practice whatever their ideology is, whatever their religion is. A lot of people woke up and said, hold on, this is not what's supposed to happen in America. It doesn't matter what's going on. These are absolute rights. This is why we formed this nation. That woke too many people up very quickly, because the policies were changed in a very short period of time. Now, we can dive into that perspective and analyze why did these central planners decide to speed up the process of their agenda, but that's a whole other discussion. The point is, when we notice the change, whether it's minor or major, or if you're in the minority where you're actually keeping up to date with all these little changes that are happening, find something you can take action on, be part of the solution, and don't be part of the problem.